All right, guys, this week at UFC 310, we have Kron Gracie fighting this guy. Kron comes from the Gracie family, which is a little bit like royalty in MMA. So if you know nothing about the Gracie family, maybe your boyfriend is forcing you to watch this UFC card with him, or you're an absolute beginner, here is the spark notes on everything you need to know about Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. First off, what even is Jiu-Jitsu? Remember that this guide is for beginners. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, or BJJ, is by far the most common form of Jiu-Jitsu used in MMA. It's also like basically the same thing as Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. And Jiu-Jitsu is primarily grappling, which is the stuff that happens on the ground in the UFC fight. So you get on the ground and you use leverage, weight distribution, you kind of try to get a dominant position and search for a submission to end the fight. Submissions usually happen by isolating someone's neck through a choke, their legs, or their arms. And all a submission is putting your opponent in an uncomfy enough position that they have to tap out or quit. Jiu-Jitsu was originally created as a way for smaller people to be able to defend themselves and fight much larger people. However, in MMA, that doesn't really matter because weight classes exist. You're not going to fight anybody who's that much bigger than you. Now, for a brief history of Jiu-Jitsu, Jiu-Jitsu does pull from a lot of different cultures and history, so this is just the high-level basics, okay? Don't come for me. Jiu-Jitsu basically got its roots in Japan in the 1600s. A lot of samurais would use it as part of their training and fighting. They would use a mixture of Jiu-Jitsu and Judo. And then around the 1880s, it became less of a violent, actual combat fighting people situation and more of an athletic pastime, something that's educational and more of a sport. Now, in 1914, this guy Maeda went from Japan to Brazil in order to teach Jiu-Jitsu. During this time, he took on a new student, Carlos Gracie, and that's where this whole thing began. Carlos and his brother Helios fell in love with Jiu-Jitsu. They loved it, but slowly over time, they adapted it to more work for them, and it became what is known as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Now, you may be thinking, Kennedy, why are there so many different types of Jiu-Jitsu? What's the difference? In traditional Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, you had a lot more tools at your disposal. There was a lot more judo-like throws. There was striking, a lot of joint locks, things like that. Whereas Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Gracie Jiu-Jitsu has this focus on ground fighting. In this type of Jiu-Jitsu, you're focused more on submissions, on positional dominance. This is the type of Jiu-Jitsu that you're probably familiar with. And really, for all intents and purposes, Gracie Jiu-Jitsu and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu are like the same thing. However, I would say if you're going to make a distinction that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is more focused on the competitive side of things, it is more of like a sport. You have a lot more tools that you could use at your disposal, and that's more strictly what's used in MMA. By contrast, Gracie Jiu-Jitsu has a larger focus on self-defense, and they do tend to have a more structured curriculum. So from there, the Gracies just became like the Jiu-Jitsu mafia. Like, look at all of them there. Carlos and Helio kicked everything off by learning Jiu-Jitsu and adapting it into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu / Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. Then Rory and Gracie, one of their sons, went over to the United States and started the first ever Gracie Jiu-Jitsu Academy. And then that same guy, in 1993, was a co-founder in starting the UFC. The UFC and the Gracies are like... So he co-founds the UFC, okay? Then that guy's brother, Royce Gracie, wins UFC 1, 2, and 4. And the UFC at that time was tournament style, and it was single elimination, so you would fight multiple times in one night. There wouldn't be any weight classes, there wasn't any rounds, there were no rules. It was crazy. And Royce Gracie was able to kick butt and win a ton of them through Jiu-Jitsu. Now, at that time, a lot of people didn't know much about Jiu-Jitsu. However, all these other fighters were getting beaten by this guy who just rolls around on the ground. So at that point, all of these other fighters are like, hey, we need to start learning this Jiu-Jitsu thing. And fast forward to now, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a fundamental part of a martial arts curriculum. Very shortly afterward, the Gracies ended up selling their stake in the UFC due to some differences of opinion, but their legacy in this sport is still very much present. And let me tell you, there have been a bajillion Gracie MMA fighters. Now, they fought on all different types of promotions. However, these guys are the ones that have fought in the UFC. This weekend, we are seeing Kron Gracie fight. Unfortunately, like the rest of his family, he did not get a name starting with R. He is a featherweight, so he weighs in at 145 pounds. He debuted in 2019 13, and he has an okay record. He has 5 wins and 2 losses. And he always looks like he just kind of got out of bed, but he's fighting Bryce Mitchell this weekend, who is another fighter with a lot of lore behind him, so it should be a pretty fun matchup. Also, hi, I'm Kennedy. I am not new to making this content. However, I am super new to YouTube. You can find me also on these channels, but I am a YouTube baby, so feel free to support by subscribing, commenting, liking. All of that good stuff would be super appreciated. But if not, that's cool too.